Hi, this is Julia Lundstrom, your hostess for the Live Long Well Summit. And today I have with me someone who's going to be talking about a specific connection in our bodies that's probably one of the most important connections we have. I have Don Siclari, who's an entrepreneur, an expedition paramedic, and functional metabolic medicine specialist. He's based between London and the US. He went to paramedic school concurrently with an undergrad where he majored in psychology and pre-med. During college, he started a business, which he grew while working as a paramedic, and then took a break from medicine for a while to grow the business. But eventually, he dove back into medicine. He's completing his fellowship in metabolic and nutritional medicine through George Washington University, and he's completing his master's degree in advanced practice paramedic and nurse practitioner through the University of Cumbria in the UK. He travels internationally doing expedition and humanitarian medical work. Don has experience in traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and has studied various other healing modalities, including massage, Reiki, NLP, and hypnosis. So with that, welcome, Don. So Don, you're going to talk to us today about the connection between our gut and our brain, which is one of, if not the most important connection in our entire bodies. So can you elaborate on that?
I can. As I have gone through these studies, I've become quite fascinated with the connections between the gut and the brain. In fact, there's some speculation at this point that our guts developed before the brain in our heads during the process of evolution. Now, over the years, of course, there's been such phrases as feeling it in your gut, butterflies in your stomach, people talk about feeling anxiety in their stomach. And those have sort of been colloquial phrases, but the fact is that there's science to that. There is a huge connection between the brain and the gut via the vagus nerve. And what we're finding is that the importance of the gut microbiota, meaning the bacteria that are in our guts that process our food and assimilate our nutrients, can send signals to the brain, which then causes us to crave certain foods. So, for example, in our bodies, we have more bacterial cells than we have human cells, and the majority of those are in the gut. When we're balanced, when our gut, when we call the microbiota, we have a diverse mixture of microflora in the gut, we generally are healthy because those bacteria literally digest our food. Now, it becomes a vicious cycle when you start looking at the modern diet, especially in this country, America, where I am right now, and the health problems that people have becomes circular. So what we're finding is that when there's a preponderance of what we call pathogenic or unhealthy bacteria in the gut, those bacteria are able to cause our brains to crave certain foods. So when we eat things like simple sugars, trans fats, processed foods, things like that, those foods actually feed the wrong bacteria, who then send signals to our brain to crave more of those foods. So it becomes a vicious cycle, and that's just one piece of it. When you start looking at the associated detrimental effects of the cardiovascular system and all the other systems of our body, we see how it's all connected and how it is a vicious cycle. You focus on gut-brain, so we'll kind of stay there, but it's also interconnected. Mood and memory, all of those, at least one of them, serotonin, which I'm sure you've heard of, is known as the mood hormone because it's responsible for our mood. And all of the modern antidepressants, the SSRIs, target serotonin and seek to increase it as a means of treating depression. Well, 85% of serotonin is produced in the gut. So when we don't have the right mixture of microflora in our gut, we can't produce serotonin in the right quantities. So that itself leads to low mood, depressive disorders, anxiety, things like that. So you start to get a sense of just how interconnected everything is, and it becomes not only fascinating, but quite complex and intricate, but yet not, because you start to see how simple things like eating the proper diet begins to balance the whole body.
But it also makes sense why we're kind of addicted to certain foods like carbohydrates and sugars, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. When we start looking at addiction, we look at a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And one of the issues, dopamine is known as the reward neurotransmitter. It's responsible for our sense of reward when we do something that we feel like doing. For example, if you are craving, say, a Big Mac, you eat it, you feel kind of a reward. That's dopamine. And what we're finding is that a lot of the drugs used to treat such conditions as ADD affect dopamine. And we're finding that young people who are diagnosed with things like ADD, whether they actually legitimately have it or not, it's a pretty overdiagnosed disorder in the US. A lot of the drugs like Ritalin and such that are used to treat those increase dopamine. And what you've got is kids tagging reward behavior to external circumstances and things outside themselves that would not innately generate reward behavior in humans. I mean, there are certain things that do generate reward behavior in humans, such as eating when you're hungry, sex, accomplishment, kind of natural behaviors. But you start looking at, like you brought up, the reward behavior of eating a large pizza or a large bowl of French fries or something. That then becomes an interaction between the bad bacteria in the gut and the neurotransmitters, and you start creating more of this vicious cycle.
So you're saying that when you're on sort of these drugs that mess with the dopamine, that the normal dopamine response that you would get by eating, let's say, an ice cream cone is going to be amplified because you're on these drugs?
It could be, yeah. I'm not aware that there are any. There may be. I don't know if there are any actual controlled trials on that specific example, but in theory, yes, that could be the case.
Wow. So the bacteria in the gut, I mean, you said that there are more bacteria in our bodies than there are human cells. So how are they controlling, I mean, you said that they produce serotonin. How are they controlling all the other hormones?
Hormone balance. Hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. Everyone's heard of cholesterol. It's kind of been demonized, fats are bad and everything else. But what's really interesting is when you start looking at the rise of heart disease, it tends to correlate with the fad in America towards low-fat diets. It kind of all happened in the 90s. And I don't remember the specifics, but the original scientist who came out with the whole low-fat idea in the 50s, we've found that he'd actually buried his contrary research to just push this one agenda. So in the 80s and 90s, you've got everyone moving to margarine, which is just, you might as well be eating plastic, low-fat diets and everything else, and you've got this associated increase in heart disease. Well, why is that? One of the processes we have to look at is synthesis of hormones from cholesterol. So we have all these people taking drugs to lower their cholesterol. And cholesterol is quite a complicated area, and I know that's kind of more cardiovascular and less gut, but stay with me.
What is it in general? Can you just give us an overview of what cholesterol really is? We've all heard of it, but I don't think anyone has an idea of what it is.
Cholesterol is a molecule that carries lipids. It carries triglycerides. It carries lipids around the body, and those lipids are used to synthesize hormones. There's two different kinds of cholesterol, what they call, well, actually there's more than two, but the two that what people are most familiar with are HDL and LDL, low-density lipoprotein, high-density lipoprotein. And those are the carriers of cholesterol. Now, there's kind of a general consensus that higher HDL and lower LDL is a good thing, but it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't know how deep you want to go into cholesterol, but let me just say this. We're finding that the hormones are synthesized from the cholesterol, whether it be HDL or LDL, and it's a pathological change in the LDL that causes the heart problems. So it's not just the amount of LDL you have, but you have to start looking at the size of the particles, the number of the particles, whether it's been oxidized, whether it's been pathologically changed to create an immune response, because it's the immune response to the cholesterol that creates atherosclerotic plaques and heart disease. When we come back to hormones, we're talking about lipid carriers that the hormones are produced from. So when you have a whole bunch of people taking statin drugs, which lower total cholesterol and lower LDL, under a certain point, your body can no longer efficiently synthesize hormones. And so there you've got a role of dietary intake. And the majority of cholesterol is synthesized in the body, but 25% of it is absorbed from food. One of the best things that we can do to kind of give an action step here is to follow a moderate to high fat intake, but the key is to use the right kinds of fat. Monounsaturated fats like olive oil are amazingly good, highly anti-inflammatory. Fats like certain saturated fats like grass-fed butter are also quite effective. So what we need to do is we need to look at this whole paradigm of fat is bad and get more specific with it. And no, fat is good. Fat is absolutely essential for life. All of our cell membranes contain lipids. The neurons in our brain communicate through lipid layers in their cell membranes. So if we don't have enough fat intake, it affects everything in our body, not just hormones, but everything. And the whole movement towards high carbs, kind of lower fat, is really backwards, and it's really throwing a lot of our metabolic processes off. We can get into what's wrong with carbs, but we know from evidence that carbs, especially refined carbs, high levels of refined carbs, do contribute to heart disease and coronary artery disease and what we call leaky gut, leaky brain. So another really interesting connection between the gut and the brain is that the endothelial cells, the cells that line the junctions, are the same in the brain and in the gut. So when you have, for example, leaky gut, people that have food sensitivities and so forth that are causing their guts to allow the food molecules to sort of, what happens is the junctions, if you can follow this, the junctions in the gut, we call them tight junctions, are kind of like this. They're very tight. And when we eat something that causes a reaction, there are certain hormones that are released that cause the junctions to open. And the immune system then responds and attacks those food molecules as if they're foreign invaders. When that process happens in the gut, it's also happening in the brain. And there's some evidence that cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and some of these diseases of the brain are actually caused by inflammatory processes in the brain, which mirror inflammatory processes in the gut. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. So, to backtrack a little bit about the fat then helps, I just want to kind of clarify, because it is a big misnomer that everybody is on this low-fat diet, and we've been brainwashed forever that you shouldn't eat fat, and it is around the right types of fat, you're right. I mean, we're not going to go around eating bacon all day, but
some people do that.
I'm a big bacon fan, but so when you're talking about the fat, I mean, we know your brain is also 60% fat, right? So you need to feed the fat that's in your brain and the balance that's in your gut. So that's really important. And then how does that kind of correlate with the linings that's in your gut that matches your brain? And then how does that correlate with the certain diseases? I'm trying to kind of go through, if you know what I mean.
Okay, so then what we need to do is back up and talk about the immune system, because the majority, I think the latest statistic I heard was 90% of disease is caused by inflammation. So what is inflammation? Let's define it. Inflammation is a dysregulated immune response, meaning the immune system is doing its job. It's just responding to the wrong stimuli. Now, the immune system was designed to protect us against viruses, bacteria, fungi, foreign invaders. And it didn't evolve along with modern diets, which have only come about in the past 100 years or so. It has a limited number of ways to respond to it, unlimited, infinite number of insults. What happens is, if you eat something that you're, say, let's use a really extreme example and then we'll backtrack. Let's use celiac disease, which is a allergic reaction to gluten, a very serious allergic reaction. A person with celiac disease eats gluten. The reaction in the gut causes those tight junctions to open, causes the immune system to come into the gut, the bowel lumen, and attack the gluten. Okay? And we have this enormous, overwhelming inflammatory response, as if somebody had just injected, a vial of strep into us, right? So those immune cascades cause each of the immune cells, that we call the white blood cells, has a signaling mechanism that signals for more white blood cells to come in and attack the invader. And then in a disease like celiac, we actually have a person who's developed antibodies to gluten. So that causes an even more pronounced inflammatory cascade. Now, that overactive immune system, all of that inflammation, the leakiness, fluid, all those cell signalers, which under the right conditions do their job and save our lives. But when they're dysregulated and chronic, all those inflammatory mediators wreak loads of havoc on our bodies. So we're finding that inflammation, the body is designed to handle inflammation in short periods. It's that kind of whole stress analogy that I like to use, in that the stress response, the fight or flight response, as we call it, is designed for see tiger, run from tiger, run up tree, safe, go home, eat, right? It takes 15 to 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and you get a massive dump of adrenaline, followed by a massive dump of cortisol, and then within a couple of hours, all that's resolved, we're back to normal. Modern people have kind of chronic stress, right? And that chronic stress causes not only a chronically elevated level of adrenaline, which adrenaline causes our heart to beat faster, our blood vessels to constrict. That alone leads to blood pressure, heart problems, and so forth. But also a dysregulated called cortisol curve. Cortisol is kind of natural. It's constantly dumping itself into our system. And what it does is it will preferentially draw from the upstream hormones. So when you look at the hormone synthesis, there is a long chain of events. One hormone is synthesized to another hormone, is synthesized to another hormone, to another hormone. And cortisol is considered an essential hormone for emergency situations, right? So when you are in a stressful situation, your body will rob the upstream hormones that are producing things, the end result, which are like our sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, etc. It'll rob the elements that are producing those hormones to produce cortisol. So there you've got a lowering of our sex hormones, and we can go into the effect of hormones on cognition memory as well. But to come back to your original question, that dysregulated chronic inflammatory response just wreaks havoc on our brain and our gut. And over decades, what we see is the development of things like dementia, Alzheimer's disease. They're no longer thinking that age-related cognitive decline is in fact age-related. It's more related to hormone decline, which we can get into, and chronic inflammation.
Which over time, I imagine, is what does the damage. So it still can be kind of related to age because it's inflammation over
Sure.
years and years and years, right? But not necessarily because you're 80.
Exactly. We no longer need to accept the old adage that grandma told us that her memory is no longer working because she's old. It doesn't have to be that. We know that we can keep our bodies optimized, we can keep our hormones in balance, and that will keep our cognition and memory, short of other factors, genetic factors, or other causative factors for disease. To take all of those out, if it's just a hormone issue, we can keep that balance through what we know about the body.
Okay, so going back to kind of the hormone balance in your gut, because it's not just serotonin, there are lots of hormones that your gut produces, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the hormones are produced in the gut, and they're produced in the sex organs, and they're produced in the kidney, the adrenals. There's kind of a shared responsibility all over the body. But serotonin is the one that's most produced in the gut, to the ratio of 85%.
Okay, so how do we get that more in balance?
Okay, well, the first thing is balancing our gut microbiota. So making sure that we're eating a balanced diet, which generally 70 to 80% of your plate should be vegetables with loads of olive oil, a bit of meat as long as it's clean and it's grass-fed and it's not full of hormones, ironically enough. Because one of the issues we have with modern diets is we are exposed to so many what we call endocrine disruptors, chemicals in the food, in cosmetics around us, in cleaning solutions and so forth, that completely disrupt our endocrine processes. For example, in America, I know that it's not legal in Europe anymore, but there's a chemical called bisphenol A, BPA, which is put in plastics. BPA mimics estrogen. So it gets into the body and it creates all kinds of havoc because it mimics estrogen, but it doesn't have the same effects as natural estrogen. It partially activates the estrogen receptors. Now, when you start looking at the fact that they will give cows estrogen to fatten them up and make them produce more milk and so forth, now we're eating milk that's full of hormones, eating milk and meats that are full of hormones. Milk's another topic altogether. But the other factor is the massive amounts of antibiotics we have in the food supply. What do antibiotics do? They kill bacteria, mostly indiscriminately. So if you take, a dose of antibiotics, your gut will suffer the effects. So there's things you can do to mediate that and restore the balance. But antibiotics kill bacteria. Antibiotic means bacteria. Yeah. So when we're eating foods that are chronically full of hormones and antibiotics and chemicals, we are just destroying our gut. Now, the thing about the gut that's really interesting, it's very resilient. We can see changes within 3 days from making a change. It's very resilient and it's very responsive. First thing we can do is to clean up our diets. Make sure that we're eating organic foods. Make sure we're getting lots of vegetables and appropriate fats, and keeping the carbs in moderation.
What would you say is that you said it's about 70 to 80% vegetables? What would you say would be the amount of carbs, amount of fat?
Well, if we're going to look at the macronutrients, I'm a big fan of about 20 to 25% carbs, 50% fat, and the rest is protein. In all the research I've looked at, and I did quite a bit of this over the summer because I was in search of what's the correct balance. Because with all these fat diets you hear, Atkins says this, and Zone says this, and Engine 2 says this, and Ornish says this, and so I wanted to know, what is the appropriate balance. Now, the other thing is that metabolism is individual, so it's going to be a little bit different for everyone. So I can't say, to the T, you should be at 20% carbs, 50% fat, 30% protein. You need to find your exact balance. But in general, if you look at approximately equal amounts of carbs and protein, and approximately double that in appropriate fats, and we're talking about calories. Now, fat has 9 calories per gram, carbs and protein is 4, so you can get more than double the effect for eating half as much of the fat. So that doesn't mean when I say 50% fat, you need to go get the fattiest chopped steak you can and just eat all the fat. No, dump a bunch of olive oil on, your coconut oil, grass-fed butters, your things like that. You want to really try to avoid as much of the saturated fats that are in meats as you can. So, enjoy your piece of meat, but don't specifically go for the fat, eat that constantly. Instead, use your grass-fed butter, your coconut oil, your cleaner saturated fats, if you will. So once you start balancing that, then that kind of sets the stage. So in Chinese medicine, when I was studying acupuncture as a teenager, one of the things concepts that fascinated me was the importance of the stomach. The Chinese knew this 5,000 years ago. We're just discovering this, but the stomach is associated with the earth energy, and it's considered the foundation of our entire metabolism, which makes sense because it processes our food. And where do we get our energy from? Our food. Unless you're breatharian, they exist out here. Most of us eat food and enjoy it, and that's where we get our energy from. That comes from the stomach. So starting with the gut, and whenever I work with a client, a patient, I always start with the gut. I always first look at diet, I'll look at certain inflammatory markers, certain gut markers, and clean up the gut. Because just doing that alone sets the stage for the whole rest of the body to come into balance. Sometimes you don't need to do much more because the body is very resilient and it likes to find balance in homeostasis. If you give it just a little bit of impetus and stop giving it ingredients that cause it to attack itself, inflammation, the rest of it may balance out. And there are other things you can do. You can look at hormone levels. You can do hormone replacement. There's lots and lots of different things that can be done. You can look at different markers and take supplements. And it's a whole science of how we do all this together. But starting with the foods that we eat and what we put into our gut is number one in my opinion.
Okay, so your first starting point to balance the gut health is to look at your diet and change your diet.
Yes, I'm working right now with a patient who's had chronic fibromyalgia and a bunch of other long laundry list of issues that have been first she was very, very young, including food allergies and sensitivities and so forth. And I started with her with the gut. And, she's already fitting into smaller clothes, her bloating's gone down and so forth. And then from there, it's obviously her situation's a lot more complicated than just cleaning up her diet. But I always start there because I want to see what the body will do when it's kind of like, if you have a car and you get cheap gas and there's, a bit of water in the tank, the gas starts getting low, the car starts knocking, it's not performing that well. Well, what could you do? You could take it to the dealer and have them troubleshoot the engine, maybe put a new engine in, spend tens of thousands of dollars perhaps, depending on what kind of car it is. Or you can just go get better gas and see if the situation corrects itself. Usually you start there. It costs a lot less.
Yeah. I recently heard a great saying that food isn't just fuel for our bodies, but it's actually information. It's giving our cells the information on how to perform.
It's giving ourselves the information on how to perform, and it's giving our brain the information on what to crave. So that's what's really fascinating to me, this connection between, there's a major nerve branch called the vagus nerve, and that connects the gut and the brain, and that's how the signaling is happening. So we start looking at, food cravings and such. Just changing your diet for a week may change your entire food cravings, and all of a sudden, you're preferring salad, and you're not craving pizza or the French fries or kind of quick release carbs and things that cause an entirely other cascade of effects with insulin and other hormones and such.
Yeah, I'll just share my personal experience. I was trying to lose some baby weight and went on keto. And I tell you, after 3 months of being on it, I had a pizza, and I love pizza.
I'm Italian. I love pizza too.
It's one of my favorite. I think it's probably my favorite food, but it wasn't that good anymore. It's just, your body just kind of loses the palate for it.
It does. Unless I'm in Italy, in which case I have to have pizza. but that's a whole other discussion.
That's a whole other story.
The difference between Italian flour and American flour is, that's another conversation. It's an entirely different thing. But here's an interesting tidbit. You hear a lot of people who have issues with gluten and such that will say things like, well, I went to Italy and I was able to handle the food there better. Well, a big factor of that is, in fact, the difference between the processing of flour there and the processing of flour here. Here, I'm in America at the moment. But here's the other thing to consider. They're finding that a lot of these food intolerances are actually mediated by this hormone I was talking about called cortisol. So when you're on holiday, when you're on vacation, you're relaxed, your cortisol is lower. You're not getting that same response, and people, can handle things better. So what does that tell us about changing our lifestyle and changing our stress level, which would be the next thing I would recommend after changing that, really concurrent with changing our diet, is starting to look at how do we balance our stress level. And little things. So here's another interesting tidbit. The heart is the heart rate and such is controlled by, we have two main nervous systems in our body, our sympathetic and our parasympathetic. Right? Sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response, and parasympathetic, they say, is feed or breathe, kind of these human terms, right? So the heart responds within milliseconds to parasympathetic input, but within seconds to sympathetic input. So what this means is if we do things when we're feeling stressed, like take a few breaths, just sit back, take 3 deep breaths, our heart will actually instantly respond to that. And so, there's actually now studies on this stuff, evidence in the literature about such things as meditation and breathing and any activity that causes us to increase our parasympathetic nervous response, which in turn causes us to secrete less adrenaline and less cortisol, which then in turn allows us to make more of our hormones that have a multitude of effects from, libido to well-being to cognition and on. So this goes back to how interconnected everything is. So my second piece of advice after changing your diet would be find a way to change your stress level. And, simple steps like, I love coffee. I'm a big fan of coffee, but I buy the coffee that I drink at a plantation in Costa Rica. So I know it's clean, and I know the caffeine level is relatively low compared to other coffees. If you're drinking a lot of cheap coffee, you may be taking in mold, but that's a whole other thing. But you're also getting a much higher level of caffeine. If you're drinking coffee all day, along with the typical breakfast of a quick release carb, a croissant or a donut or something like that, you're flooding your body with all kinds of signals to initiate all these stress responses. Cortisol, because caffeine stimulates cortisol and adrenaline. Too much of it, right? I was reading a study this morning, actually. Somebody posted one of these sites on Facebook saying, I'm going to stop drinking coffee because studies show that coffee increases cortisol. Okay, my third piece of advice is don't believe everything you read. When you see something like that on Facebook, there's probably a kernel of truth to it, but we have to go through and look at the actual research because, these studies are done and then some publisher creates a headline, a hype headline to sell something, which may or may not have anything to do with the actual study. So the actual study that I read was 300 and 600 milligrams of caffeine, respectively, does cause a significant increase in cortisol when it's done on somebody who hasn't had any caffeine for 5 days.
And how much is 300 to 500 grams of caffeine?
Your single shot of espresso is about 80. A cup of coffee is about 120 to 150, depending on the coffee. So we're talking about 2 to 4 cups of relatively cheap coffee, because the better quality of the coffee, the lower the caffeine content. But they also found that for people that drink, coffee every day, the effects are not anywhere near as extreme. And 300 to 600 is, in my opinion, a lot. I mean, I take my coffee fairly weak. But the point is that I'm not saying don't drink coffee. I'm saying if you're drinking cheap coffee all day, along with eating, sugars and things like that, you are causing the stress response within your body. The adrenaline and the cortisol, which then has all those effects we were talking about earlier, which rob your body of the ability to produce the other hormones that are related to our well-being.
Okay, so balancing your gut flora, we start with the diet, and it's not
actually. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let's start with diet, but we think in terms of remove. So the first thing you want to do is remove the offending agent, right? So if we clean up our diet, there's a thing called the elimination diet. And if you're somebody that thinks you might have food intolerances, thinks you might be having negative responses to foods that you eat and so forth, but you're not sure where to start, you could go out and get a whole food panel that'll tell you what all of your allergies are, your sensitivities and allergies. There's a difference in the type of immune response rates. You could do that. Or you could do what's called an elimination. And you can find these on the internet. I have one that I'd be happy to send to people if they'd like. But what that does is it creates an eating plan that eliminates all of the typical foods that we could react to. And I'm a big fan of starting with that first, because when we do that and we clean it, we give our gut time to heal, our food sensitivities change. So let's say that you react to dairy, Well, if you take milk out of your diet for, say, 3 to 5 weeks, you might find you can handle a cappuccino after that just fine, because you've given your body time to reset itself, you've given your gut time to heal. So in my approach, I don't do food sensitivity testing in the beginning. I do it down the line in the elimination diet. So the first thing you want to do is, I'd recommend an elimination diet. Remove everything that could be causing you to have reactions, to be bloated and inflamed, and feel groggy, and all these symptoms that go with after you eat something that your body doesn't want. And then you can begin to reintroduce things one at a time and see how you react. From there, the next thing is, get some good probiotics and start to re-inoculate your gut, re-inoculate the microflora in your gut, and see what happens. So it's a process of removing the things that are causing the responses and adding the things that are going to reduce the inflammation and give the bacteria a chance to reestablish themselves. Now, here's another thing I would strongly recommend is taking in what we call prebiotics, which are starches. Starches are foods that our bodies don't digest and assimilate. They move through us, but the bacteria in our guts use them. So one thing that you can do is eat a lot of green bananas. Green bananas have a kind of starch called resistant starch that the bacteria love. It's very prebiotic. So if you make a smoothie, try a green banana instead of a yellow banana, and you're feeding.
They don't taste very good.
They don't taste very good, but in a smoothie, you can also buy green banana powder. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to hack this and short circuit it, but increasing starches along with the other tips I gave you would be useful for gut bacteria.
But you're not going through and eating a bunch of potatoes or anything that are really high in starch?
Not that kind of starch, no. We're talking about resistant starches that are processed entirely differently. Potatoes are a quick-release carb, a high glycemic index carb. Our body treats potatoes kind of like it treats bread and sugars and things like that. Sweet potatoes are a different animal, but actually regular potatoes and sweet potatoes are in different families. They're not actually both... like if you look at peppers, you can get a green pepper and a yellow pepper. They're the same family. Potatoes and sweet potatoes are entirely different. So I don't even know how they got named. But sweet potatoes have a much lower glycemic index, meaning that they're causing a lot less of an insulin spike, which is another thing.
Okay, so let's go through just a few more of the foods that you would eliminate. Dairy,
Okay.
you said.
I recommend you want to eliminate dairy, wheat. Those are really the two biggest ones. Just eliminate, and I don't like to throw too much at people. Just eliminating those alone will go a long way. Now, let's do sugar. We should eliminate sugar. Let's eliminate bad fats and oils. So no margarine, no rapeseed oil, which we call canola here in the U.S. No soy oil because most of it's genetically modified. Can we talk about GMOs for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this is a major, major problem in the U.S. And there's a big movement for what we call corporate farming here. There's a company that's responsible for all of it. And they own the majority of the farms in the U.S. And they produce this pesticide called glyphosate, we know as Roundup. Okay. Glyphosate, so what happens is when they modify it's a wheat killer. So they modify the corn, the soy, and the wheat, and the other crops such that it's resistant to the glyphosate. When they come in and they spray the crops with this weed killer, which in theory is great because it kills all the weeds, doesn't affect the foods we want to eat, and farmers don't have to worry about all the weeds to go out and do the work by hand. In theory, it's great, but that glyphosate is one of the most toxic substances on earth, and it stays in the food. So then we take it into our guts, and it just wreaks havoc. It's an organophosphate, which is a type of toxin that just wreaks havoc with our gut bacteria. It destroys it. And I know somebody who eats 100% organic. When she travels, she orders from Whole Foods to her hotel room and so forth. She tested high in glyphosate. This stuff is everywhere. 93% of Americans, in the study I've read, have high levels of glyphosate. So we need to eliminate anything genetically modified, anything that might have these chemicals. So when I say elimination diet, I'm not just talking about eliminating foods that we might be reacting to. I'm also talking about eliminating chemicals. So just cleaning up the diet, going all organic, getting rid of the dairy, cheap fats, the sugars, gluten, wheat in general, because gluten is not the only wheat protein that we react to. Just take the wheat out altogether. And then, some people react to corn, some people react to soy, some people react to legumes. So you can take all of that out. You can really go quite extreme if you want to eliminate everything that might possibly be causing you issues. And there are templates and protocols for this that you can get. But the big ones that I would say start with are wheat, dairy, sugar, and chemicals and bad fats.
Then let's go to what foods you should be taking in kind of place of those and foods that are anti-inflammatory.
Lots of vegetables. The more colorful your plate is, the better it is. And the more raw those vegetables are, the better they are for you. Now, there are some caveats there. Vegetables like kale is actually easier to digest if it's heated. Breaks down the protein.
It tastes so much better.
It does, and this whole eat more kale, throw it in smoothies raw is really funny because I can't have a smoothie with kale. I get bloated, it affects me. But that's a perfect example of the kind of fads we deal with here in America. Eat more kale. Everyone eat more kale. Okay, well, maybe we should be looking at cooking it first, steaming it. But in general, most vegetables lose their enzymes if you keep them too much. So we need those enzymes to process them. Nature kind of provides that for us. It provides a processing vehicle within the foods we eat to help us process it. Well, we cook everything, doing those enzymes. So the vegetables as raw as you can get, or steamed, lightly cooked. What you want to avoid is deep frying. And with meat, this is a big one. When you cook meat too much, the byproducts of that heating are actually toxic. So heating meat just enough so that it's cooked and so forth, by steaming, by broiling, grilling actually can be quite bad. To be fair, I'm not saying don't ever cook on a grill, but if you're overcooking your meat to where it's browning, you're generating chemicals from that heating process that are going to wreak some havoc on the body. So, but again, if we are looking at meats, we should look at everything organic and grass-fed as much as possible. Same with vegetables. Now, there's something called the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. And if you Google that, it'll bring you up a list of both of those. And what they are is lists of foods that are more or less okay if they're not organic, and definitely not if they're not organic. There are obviously 30 dozen. There's 12 foods that you should not ever eat not organic. The Clean 15 are you might be okay if you have them because they tend to be clean. And then adding in, like I said, the coconut oil, the olive oil, lots and lots of olive oil. But obviously you have to get organic olive oil because there are some olive farmers that spray their olives with pesticides. Increasing the fats, looking for unprocessed sources of everything is really big key. And then vegetables, heat them, steam them lightly, try not to overcook them. They'll do you better that way.
Awesome. So, this has been very informative, and it's awesome that you're talking about the whole connection between the brain and the gut, and doing these type of things, eliminating, adding in the good stuff, taking probiotics, really will reset our gut flora, and we should be able to see a noticeable difference in our brain health, in our moods, right?
Yep. Yeah. You should be able to. Now, the other thing that we can talk about is the role of our hormones in the brain. Our brains are literally bathed in hormone receptors. I'm not talking about our sex hormones, testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. So when you look at conditions like PMS, that tends to be a low progesterone scenario, which often is actually caused by taking oral contraceptives, because oral contraceptives are they have progesterone-like effects, but they're called progestins. They're not complete progesterones, and your body doesn't entirely know what to do with them. But people that suffer from a lot of PMS often have a progesterone imbalance, and why we feel moody. But women feel moody. They crave foods. All of these things are exactly what we're talking about. Brain is bathed in hormone receptors. So keeping our hormones balanced is critical for that. And when you're looking at perimenopausal and postmenopausal women, there's often declines in different hormones and things. And all of that can be assessed and treated by a hormone replacement doctor who can prescribe the right amounts of things like that. So my whole point is that we're finding that by maintaining our hormone balance as we get older, we can slow down or eliminate cognitive decline, dementia, senility, all these things that we tend to associate with aging.
Well, we like that. That's what this is all about. It's doing what you need to do today to not only live the longest or the healthiest life today, but also make sure you're living long and healthy until you're 80, 90, 100 years old. I think so many people have this impression of a 100-year-old and they're decrepit and all this kind of stuff, but it doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, and this is something that I heard anecdotally, so I can't confirm it, but I was reading somewhere that they were saying that we, when they compare human lifespan to animals, we should be living to 120. And I say, let's go for it.
Yes, exactly.
Let's clean up our health and see where it gets us. When you look at vascular disease, hypertension, coronary artery disease, and things like that, they say that the actual disease processes predate the symptoms by decades. So things that you're eating, when you're young, that are trying to cause havoc with your vasculature, may not manifest as symptoms until many decades later, when it's too late, and the first sign could be a heart attack. We need to start, it's never too early or too late to start. You just start where you are and let your body do the rest. The body regenerates itself every 7 years. So if you used to make significant changes, the body will respond.
Well, and you said even with your gut flora, you can see changes in 3 days.
Yeah. Gut flora is really
we all want speed. That is speed. So,
well, if you think about when you eat something that doesn't agree with you, you usually feel that bloating effect for about 2 to 3 days, right? Depending on how bad it is. If I eat something that my body doesn't like, I'll still feel it the entire next day and into the day after. Conversely, here's another thing that they've discovered. If you are eating something that's not ideal, not optimal, by adding things that are into it, it will mitigate some of those effects. So, for example, when you let's look at the Mediterranean diet, which we think is probably the most healthy. So that's actually a great template. If I was going to recommend one diet template, I'd recommend the Mediterranean.
I do the same.
Do their research. It's all there. The original research came out of Crete in 1941, but it's been revalidated through the 80s and 90s and into today. It's highly anti-inflammatory. It's got all the right effects. But if you look at the Mediterranean diet, the Italians, they eat bread. But what do they eat their bread with? Olive oil. Taking the fats with the carbs slows down the absorption of the carbs. It slows down the insulin spike. And it assists the process. If you are going to eat a piece of bread, have some olive oil with it.
And I want to say that they eat a lot of fish. I live in Sweden, and I will say that there's one thing that Americans don't eat as much of, and that's fish. And I think you can tolerate a lot more when you have, the DHAs in your system and, the omega-3s and 6s and whatnot for the fatty acids, right?
Here's another big thing. If I had to recommend one supplement for people, it would be EPA and DHA, would be fish oils. Yeah, we can eat a lot of fish. We can get those. There are issues with fish, with mercury and things like that we have to look at. So
there seems like there's issues with all of our food.
It's modern living.
It's ruined our food. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's probably the one. If I had to recommend something to everybody, I would say a really good quality omega-7.
Yeah, I do the same. So last thing, Don, is there anything that you do or take or practice for yourself on a daily or weekly basis that you don't really share with anyone? It's just kind of your little secret.
I don't know that there is, to be honest. There might be, but it's not coming to mind. I mean, I'm constantly adjusting my mix of what I take, and if somebody asked me, I'd happily share it with them. But it's kind of really personalized to my own.
I think that's important too, because we are all so individualized. So all the processes you're talking about are finding. Oh,
here's one. I got one. It's not that I don't tell anybody, but I do enjoy the effects of two things. At night, I'll take GABA, which is gamma-aminobenzoic acid, which is our neurotransmitter for calmness. It's what causes us to feel calm. In fact, the benzodiazepine anxiolytics, Xanax and diazepam, Valium, things like that, affect the GABA receptor. Well, you can also just take more GABA, and that will cause you to relax. Now, I have a particular genetic, we call SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, a particular mutation in my genes that a lot of people have, which causes me to be kind of low on the GABA side and higher on the glutamate side, which is kind of there. A lot of these hormones and neurotransmitters are kind of diametrically opposed. They affect each other kind of like this. So I'll take GABA at night if I want to go to sleep, and that works really well for me. The other thing I'll do is take L-theanine with my coffee, because L-theanine counters the negative effects of caffeine. So one of the issues with caffeine is it causes vasoconstriction in the brain. It causes your blood vessels in the brain to constrict. Theanine, which actually comes from green tea, where it was first isolated, counters that effect and prevents the vasoconstriction. So it actually increases your ability to focus and concentrate. And it also has stimulatory effects on the GABA receptors, which causes you to kind of feel more. It counters the jitters of the caffeine. So it's countering the vasoconstriction and it's countering the jitters. You're still getting the benefit of the greater alertness from the caffeine, but you're getting the complementary effect of the theanine, which is mitigating the unwanted effects of caffeine. And it's interesting that green tea is so healthy, right? You look at Japan and the diet, they constantly, I lived in Japan twice, green tea is a big thing there.
Yeah, that's all. I don't drink caffeine. I just drink the green tea. So I don't have to balance the facts.
It's perfectly balanced. I mean,
yeah. So awesome. Well, Don, it's been such a pleasure. I've learned so much, and it's so important for people to hear this and to know that everything they're feeling, either whether it's depressed or anger or moodiness or PMS or even low progesterone, the male hormone, which isn't coming to me right now, everything can be affected from what's going on in your gut.
Everything, yep. And we didn't get too much into testosterone and the hormones, but I'll just end by saying that those sex hormones have a much more comprehensive effect on our systems than just things like libido and menstruation and PMS and stuff like that. Testosterone is highly anti-inflammatory. Progesterone calms the brain. I mean, so if you start looking at this, it's very complex. And in fact, last week I was preparing for this interview, I pulled out a bunch of studies and I'm trying to get all my information written down and balanced, and I realized that I'm getting way too detailed for the audience that I'm speaking to, which probably wants some simple advice that they can implement right away. So hopefully I was able to give something useful. The next big step I would say is look into hormone balance. Seek out we call BHRT, biological hormone replacement therapy doctor, who can test your hormone levels and adjust them, whether they do it through taking hormones or through certain nutrients that increase them. That's kind of a personalized thing. It's really based on your individual balance, which is revealed by lab tests. So there's not like one or two things everybody can do to balance the hormones except adjust their diet. It can be individualized and personalized, and all of that can be brought into balance by a clinician who can test them.
Awesome. Great recommendation. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for being here. How can people get a hold of you if they want to talk to you more about this?
My personal website is DJ Siclari, SICLARI.com. And there's some links on there to Facebook and email. But I'm happy to chat with anybody, happy to make referrals, happy to help where I can. And I do, do some assessments and take on new clients and so forth. Somebody wants to consult. So,
awesome. Well, we'll have links to your website and your Facebook where people can get a hold of you as well.
Cool. Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time and I really appreciate you sharing all this wonderful knowledge with us.